Greetings. Welcome back to our Genesis study. This is our next to last lesson. This is our 31st lesson. 31st lesson out of our study of Genesis. We're going to finish the book today. We're going to finish chapter 50, which if you know anything about Genesis, you know that there are 50 chapters. And so I'm going to go through that this morning. And then next week, Andy and I will have a time where we get to share some of the highlights that we've had, some lessons that we've learned and shared with you. Just hit on some of those points. We're not covering the whole book again. We're not going to try to do that in 30 to 40 minutes, but just stick around. Come back next week and enjoy the end of this series. And I'm excited about next quarter or the next series that we do. It's a short series, and we'll explain that in the next few weeks. Jacob has just died. In chapter 49, Jacob has just died. Joseph is mourning him at the beginning of chapter 50. Jacob has asked to be buried in the land of his ancestors. In fact, not just asked, but he made Joseph promise him that would happen. As we go through 50, I've divided this into 6 parts. Mainly for me and my disorganized mind, so I'll have something to follow. But hopefully you'll be blessed by being able to follow along and take notes and make little annotations as to where you are and what I've said. And for those of you who make it to the end of this class, who stick with it to the end, I'm going to share some bonus footage with you from a couple of weeks ago. It's been highly entertaining to me, and it might be entertaining to you as well. Let's jump off into chapter 50, and we're going to start in verses 1 through 3, and I'm calling this section the passing of Jacob, the passing. Joseph, upon his father's death, he breathes his last, Jacob does, and then Joseph, we read, fell on his father's face and weeps over him and kisses him. Natural response when someone who you care deeply for dies, passes on. And Joseph's response is a response of a son who loves his dad like crazy. So that we understand that he's going through this. But then notice verse 2, Joseph, he commands his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalm Israel. He's crying, gets up, and then gives instructions as to what they will do with his father's remains. So 40 days, verse 3, are required for him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned, notice this, or they wept, you might have. New King James has mourned, and then New American Standard, English Standard, if you're looking at the NIV, it all has wept. They all have wept. But it's noticeable to me that Joseph commands his physicians to do his father's embalming. Hebrew word for physician is healer. And obviously Jacob is past the point of being healed, so maybe the physicians also do the embalming. Whatever the case, they know how to do it. 40 days are involved, and it's a very careful, very meticulous process that they have to go through. And we know that it's meticulous and that they were experts at it because of history and the artifacts and the other things that have been unearthed and studied. Who mourned for 70 days? Joseph, naturally. His brothers, obviously. Of course, his family. But I think it's significant that the Egyptians also mourned with him for 70 days. And I believe that shows a great deal of respect for Joseph, who he was and how much he meant to Egypt as a whole. So Joseph, while they mourn for 70 days, Joseph is going to mourn for the rest of his life. And again, that's what happens when someone you love dies. So that's the passing. Next is the plea. Verses 4 through 6. Now when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Behold, I'm dying. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. And then now, therefore, please let me go up and bury my father." And then he makes this promise, "I will come back. I will come back." And the Pharaoh's response was, "Go up and bury your father as he made you swear." Again, a great deal of respect is shown to Joseph as he makes this plea, and the request is granted. Pharaoh respects Joseph highly. Obviously, if he made him second in charge over Egypt, gave him all this responsibility and all this power, obviously he respects him, but it just shows more of his respect when he lets Joseph take off with everyone to go bury his father. So that's the plea. And then we have the procession in verses 7 through 11. Joseph goes up to bury his father in 7, and with him. Now I want you to notice all of the alls that I'm getting ready to read. All of the servants of Pharaoh. This is still verse 7. The elders of Pharaoh's house. And all of the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all of the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. All of those people that Jacob leaves behind. Only their little ones, their flocks, and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with them both chariots and horsemen, and it was this is an understatement, I believe, a very great gathering. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, verse 10, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. It was an all-out, full-body mourning that everyone was doing. Everyone who went along with this group is doing. And as they're mourning, and Joseph observed 7 days of mourning, the inhabitants of Canaan notice what's going on. I don't believe you couldn't help but notice. You're going to notice when this large of a group, this regal of a group, gets together and goes through this lamentation process, because it's going to be noticeable, not just the crowd, but noticeable. And we read that the Canaanites made this statement. This is a deep mourning of the Egyptians. Therefore, its name shall be called, or it was called, Abel Mizraim, or the meadow of mourning of the Egyptians, or the mourning of the Egyptians. And that's beyond the Jordan. Why did Jacob want to be buried where he was buried, in the cave where he was buried? That's where his ancestors were. Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, Rebekah, Leah. He wanted to be buried where they were, to be brought back. Notice the alls that I read. Joseph, all of these people. This was a huge event, and not just a bunch of commoners. The elite were there, the cream of the crop, the upper crust. They attended. And again, another show of great respect for Joseph. Here he is in mourning, and they decide, we're going with him. We're going with him. I think a point can be made here that Jacob didn't ask for this. All he asked was to be promised that he would be buried in the place of his ancestors. Again, this wasn't for Jacob's sake. This was for Joseph's sake and his brothers. This big to-do wasn't for their dad. It was to honor those who survived their dad. That's why we go through the funeral process, the ceremonies and the memorial ceremonies, because we want closure. We want to honor those who have gone on, who have passed. And then we want, for our brothers and sisters who have lost loved ones, we want to be there for them as well. We've all lost loved ones. If you haven't yet, you will. That's the way of life. But when someone is there to mourn with you, I think it says a lot about you, and it says a lot about the loved ones. And so that's That is the procession. And we go from there to the promise fulfilled. And actually, this is a twofold promise, and I'll explain that. Verses 12 through 14. So his sons did for him just as he had commanded. Jacob had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field where the burial place was that Abraham had brought. And so that's one of the promises that are fulfilled. And then Joseph returns, we read at 14. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who went with him to bury his father. A twofold promise fulfilled. Yes, Jacob's last wish will be honored. That promise was made, and it was going to be fulfilled by Joseph and his brothers. And then, yes, Joseph's promise to Pharaoh again was fulfilled. He promised he would come back, and he did. That's the promise fulfilled. And then the pacification is 15 through 21. 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us, which he hadn't yet, and then he'll repay us for the evil which we did to him, which he hadn't yet. So then they sent a messenger. They didn't do it themselves. They sent a messenger saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph. Did he really say that? Most likely not. But he said, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespasses of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph, when he heard this message, he weeps. Again, he's been taking care of him. Again, he told them before, I don't hold it against you. God meant it for good. There were people who needed me to come to Egypt so I can save them, including you and your family. Then his brothers came and fell down before him in verse 18. And they fall down on their faces. They bow down before him once again. And they say, behold, we are your servants. And then Joseph's reaction. And notice this, it's a reaction of a comforter. He's pacifying them, the pacification. He uses this language of comfort. In verse 19, Joseph says to them, don't be afraid, for I am in the place of God. Don't be afraid. No, he says, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant it evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about as it is this day, to save many people alive. And then again, now therefore, he says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. Don't be afraid. And notice that he comforted them. They were afraid. They were sure that retribution was going to be had on Joseph's behalf. And so his reaction is to comfort them. Scripture says he comforted them. And then he spoke kindly to them. That word kindly, or that phrase spoke kindly to them, it means he spoke to their heart. It wasn't just trying to get through their thick skulls, their thick heads, what he was saying. He wanted to tug on their hearts emotionally. Let them know for sure, deep down inside, will you understand this? I love y'all. I'm going to take care of you. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to get even with you. I'm going to take care of you. Because God made all of this happen. And again, he gives credit to God, as he has been for years and years and years. He gives credit to God for his ability to interpret dreams. He gives credit to God for all of the success that he's had throughout his life in Egypt. And he gives credit to God for God putting him where he needed to be in order to save all of these people, all of Egypt. but all of the people around Egypt, all of the people from the different places that were coming for food. And so what did Joseph's brothers get instead of retribution? They got pacification, they got comfort, they got reassurance that he would take care of their families. And finally, we have the prophetic promise from 22 to 26. Joseph lets his people know that he's lived for 110 years. And he's going to let his people know in 23, he experiences generation after generation of his children and his children's children and their children of being born and raised in front of his eyes. Not just him, his family, but his brothers' families, his dad's families carry on his household. And so he watches this growth take place. He lives to 110. What a wonderful thing to be able to see your generations come into the world and being raised into the world. In 24, he says to his brethren, I'm dying. They're going to be sad about that. But then he says, but God, he makes this promise, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And don't you think at this point, these people know about the promises. These are relatives of Isaac, relatives of Jacob, relatives of Abraham. And don't you think, since they know these promises, they end up in Egypt for all these years. They've established homes. Their livelihood is here. And I just wonder if they weren't thinking, is this it? This isn't the place that God promised our ancestors that we would end up. How is that going to happen? So Joseph makes this promise. God will surely visit you and he will take you to the land where he promised. And then 25, we read, Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So he makes another promise. Part of that promise, God will visit you, and when he comes to take you out of this land, you'll take my bones as well, and I'll be buried in another place. And sure enough, Joshua chapter 24, verse 32, the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought out of Egypt, they buried at Shechem in the plot of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. So they do bring him out of Egypt, and he will be buried in another place that is not Egypt. Joseph then is put in storage until this will happen in a coffin after he's embalmed. Here's some applications or some lessons or some thoughts that I want to share with you. Jacob wasn't honored by the Egyptians because of anything that he had done to merit all of the times of mourning, the great procession, the way that they treated his body. No, he hadn't merited any of this. It was done because of who Jacob was, how he had been, what he had done for the Egyptians. Just that he was a spectacular person with all kinds of talents that God had given him, wisdom, foresight. His vision was clear. But he also gave God glory. And I believe and have seen, and you know it as well, that families are absolutely blessed by those members of the family who strive to be godly people. And we are ambassadors of Christ. We represent Christ. We're supposed to. We are to strive to follow Christ's will in order to represent him like we need to. We're ambassadors of Christ, and we need to be godly ambassadors. So when we are godly ambassadors, people around us will be blessed. Our families definitely will be blessed. We will be faithful examples. We will be faithful parents, faithful spouses. We will be examples to the world that lets the world know God is good, Christ is worthy to be followed, and heaven can be promised to you as well. There are many, many other lessons that we can draw from these chapters that we have tried to bring you some. Hopefully you've been blessed. We've been blessed in preparing the lessons. I've been blessed in working with Andy, and I hope he's been blessed with me as well. But it's been while the situation isn't something that we want to have continued, it's been a blessing in so many ways. And we look forward to where our spiritual lives, as far as coming together as a family, gets back to normal, if it ever will. Wonderful. But if not, we have ways of keeping in touch, and we've been blessed with having access to each other. All right, if you followed this far, here's some bonus footage that might entertain you and might just have you shaking your head. What you're getting ready to see is from a couple of weeks ago. The class is getting ready to start. Andy says that we are going to be going over chapters 47 and 48. That's not correct. I've studied for chapters 46 and 47. Keep that in mind as you watch me in the right corner quietly panic.
Together, and glad to study Genesis chapter 47, Genesis chapter 48 with you this morning. As always, we want to refresh our minds as to the purpose, the scope of Genesis, how it fits together in the Bible narrative as a whole. And it should be sinking in by this point, but Genesis is the book of beginnings. Genesis follows four great events in the first 11 chapters: the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 12, it transitions and follows four great men, beginning with Abraham, or Abram as he's known there, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph.